Eric, you've written important books about the history of the 19th century, about imperialism, about laboring men. What are the challenges of writing the history of your own century, the times you yourself have lived?
Well, one thing that's makes it difficult to write contemporary history is that you need, it seems to me, a certain amount of distance. Emotional distance as well as chronological distance from it. It's possible to do this now since the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, because you can look back and see the period from 1914 or thereabouts to 1989, 91, thereabouts, as something belonging together, as not simply a tract of time, but something which has its unity.
What then is the shape of that period, the short century?
I think the shape is, it begins with the breakdown of 19th century society. The breakdown, the reconstitution of capitalist society on a different basis. One of the byproducts of this breakdown was the October Revolution and the enormous effects globally which it had. Now, this period is over, and we find ourselves in another of the historic moments, when we find the existing world system, if you like, the world economy, world civilization, working up towards, or perhaps in the process of, a major restructuring, a major change, in direction which may not be easy to predict, impossible to predict.
What I noticed in your introduction to the book was a sense of historical change destroying the continuity between generations, erasing the past as it progresses, so that what's truly terrible about this century is people can't remember. And it makes a historian's job more difficult. It makes a historian's job more important. But there's this continual sense of the tape of the historical past being erased from people's memory by the sheer pace of change.
I think this applies to the younger generations, post-war generation, more than anything else. And I think it happens not so much because of the pace of change, but because of the change of character of society, which concentrates on the individual rather than the individual as part of a community, a society, a continuum between generations, and on the now, namely buying things, enjoying things, here and now.
And that's the enemy of historical continuity and historical memory.
Yes, because for one thing, you see, the mechanisms, in the past there are always mechanisms by which the young generation is linked with the older generations. For instance, Marc Bloch,
the great French historian,
once pointed out that in actual fact, in agrarian societies, continuity is maintained by jumping generations. Children are brought up by grandparents, because parents go out and work in the fields, and so consequently, children immediately get introduced to what grandparents remember of their past, and so on in turn.
And that's been broken up in our century.
This has been broken completely for a variety of reasons. For one thing, indeed, I mean, the experience of the past is quite often no longer relevant, or no longer seems relevant to the younger generation. And consequently, it becomes something different. The only past which people, very young people, really recognize is their own personal past. The rest is something like olden times.
What exactly do you mean by barbarism?
I mean, firstly, that in some sense, the rules of social behavior, which tend to govern all societies, must govern them if they aren't too disintegrate into some kind of Hobbesian anarchy, are under threat or under disintegration because of the changes in society which we seen and through Çağdaş. But I mean,
which changes are producing barbarism within the capitalist world?
For one thing, the growth of big cities, and I suppose I would say the fact that the mechanisms for keeping these things under control in the past are either weakened or may possibly disappear.
Which mechanisms do you mean?
The state, for one thing. You yourself, if I may say so, have pointed out that one of the reasons why in Yugoslavia you find that there is this extraordinary, uncontrolled outburst of almost erotic, I think you say, violence, is that these countries had got used over a long period to government and law having the monopoly of legitimate violence. This now disappears. There are no other rules about how to treat violence and what to do, and the result is indeed cruelty, atrocity, barbarism.
So barbarism means, to use your own phrase, the democratization of violence.
That, I think, is one aspect of it. That's obviously the aspect which we mostly notice. But at the same time, it seems to me that barbarism is also, much more specifically, the gradual weakening of the standards and aspirations of 18th century rationalism, 18th century enlightenment.